So before we get into the meat of this Cern Basher, I did want to kind of go over a couple of conversations we just had. One, we were talking about your experience as you drive your FSD around town and how some other drivers, my brother even commented to me that he's now stereotypically seeing Tesla drivers as kind of the worst drivers out there. Either because they're arrogant jerks because they're wealthy or whatever, or because they think they're better because they're in a Tesla, or because they're on FSD and maybe the car is acting a little odd. And you said you have a methodology of dealing with those people.
Yeah, when somebody pulls up next to me after, my truck has cut them off or done some kind of crazy maneuver, and they're pulling up next to you and they kind of give you a dirty look, I usually just return the look by going like this, holding up my hands as the vehicle is driving and looking at them and saying, "Sorry, it's not me."
Yeah, right. Blame it on the car. I can't.
Yeah, and then for some reason they seem to speed off very quickly after that.
Yeah, speed off, possibly giving you, fingers up,
That's right.
fingers
Yeah,
up. Yeah.
and I think we should actually begin tracking that. I think that's a sign of success.
Yes, so the number of fingers up that we receive in the course
Right.
of the drive instead of the number of disengagements.
Yeah. No, I think fingers up would be a better metric.
Yeah, all right. We'll have to talk to some of those guys that are keeping those metrics, or maybe you could start that yourself.
Well, I'm sure that cameras on the vehicle could keep track of that and count them.
Yeah,
There should
yeah.
be something on your screen that
Automatic,
shows. Yeah.
automatic. Yeah, what a thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, so you said today that we're going to talk about, Bitcoin, and also in the green room, we were talking a little bit about that. And I wonder how many in the audience have my same experience, which is like I heard about Bitcoin like from day one, practically, probably the day after the pizza exchange. I don't know if it's that soon, but I had, people coming to me, a friend is in particular, one cousin-in-law, that came and said, "Hey, do you think I ought to get in this Tesla? I mean, this Bitcoin thing? It's $12, per Bitcoin or whatever it was at the time." And I said, "I don't know. It seems like a Ponzi scheme to me." And he and I just, had Christmas a couple of weeks ago, and I once again, was very contrite. But he admitted that he probably would have sold at 24.
Mm,
So, he would have doubled his money and been thrilled, and that would have been it.
yeah.
But over the course of the last year, it's kind of gone from being this kind of, like friends tell you about the investment in tulips, to being something way more concrete, something way more like you need to know about it.
I think so. I think that's the case. And let's make an attempt today to see if we can bring some folks along and maybe help their understanding a little bit, because I
Okay.
think this is actually a very important technology that's definitely not tulips.
Yeah, and we have the POTUS elect who says he's going to potentially make it into a reserve currency. So that would be, that would definitely make it something that we should be
Yeah.
aware of the consequences or anyway, go ahead. I'm going to turn over to you.
Sounds good, Randy. So we shall start with this image. And like a lot of things that are fun these days, if they're meme worthy, then there's usually something there.
Right.
Not always the case. You shouldn't use that as your standard necessarily, but this is Michael Saylor, who's the chairman of MicroStrategy, the largest corporate holder of Bitcoin in the world.
Right.
And he posts quite a bit on X, and he includes a lot of memes about himself, which are quite funny. And he's known for saying that there is no second best when he's referring to Bitcoin.
Ah,
And so there is no second best Christmas gift.
yes, yes.
So he's being very consistent with his message.
Yes, and I suppose one could believe, when I say believe in, one could think that Bitcoin is a good thing without believing that Michael Saylor's approach is a good thing. Is that, would you?
Absolutely. Yeah, those are two different discussions. And today we'll focus more on Bitcoin in general, not so much on MicroStrategy. That's a topic for another day to dive into. John Oliver, I think, hit the nail on the head here when he said that Bitcoin is everything people don't know about computers combined with everything they don't understand about money. So that makes it a high hurdle to wrap your mind around.
Yeah,
Right.
and
These are two pretty complex topics.
yeah, and I'm going to say what I'm going to say, not because I have this massive ego, even though some people think I do. I'm going to say it because it's true, and I want it to be foundational as people listen to our discussion. I have paid a lot of attention to the understanding of money and computers for that matter, but I believe my understanding of money is at a much higher level than my understanding of computers because I really did study it very, very deeply in college, after college. Actually came up with a systematic way where I was suggesting that that countries substitute energy as the foundational building block of money as opposed to gold. So this is
Well,
something,
you're onto something there, Andy.
yeah, I might be, but I can show you the paper. I still have the paper. And, so this made a lot more sense to me in the 20th century that energy was much more important and much more um, uh, quantifiable even than gold. So anyway, that was my theory. But just to let people know, my decision not to have studied Bitcoin up till now has nothing to do with either one of these that John Oliver suggested, but I do think it's very uh, true of the general population. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, they feel one or more of these sentiments, right? That it's too good to be true.
Yeah.
How can you have something that's up 33 million X
Right.
and that make any sense? That it's money for criminals, that there's no use case, it's too volatile, it's backed by nothing. The government's going to ban it. It will be obsolete. It will be hacked.
And that's just the short list.
That's just the short list. That's right. Uses too much energy as another one,
Right. Right.
right? All these things. So this is from a presentation that Michael Saylor made, which is a really good one, and I'll reference it at the end so folks can check it out. But he states that everyone is against Bitcoin before they're for it, right? And it's because it's so difficult to understand. So you just naturally are skeptical,
Sure.
right? And himself was a big skeptic. So he wrote this back in 2013 when Bitcoin was around $100 a coin. He said, Bitcoin's days are numbered. It seems like just a matter of time before it suffers the same fate as online gambling.
Interesting, which is also had a horrible fate. Online gambling has. I mean, my God,
Right.
they're not making any money. Their stocks
There you
aren't
go.
at all.
That's right. Yeah. And so he was a skeptic as well. And now, of course, he's come full circle. And
Sure.
here's a statement from 2020. I won't bother reading it, but it was a very praiseworthy statement about Bitcoin.
Has he come around on online gambling?
Oh, I don't know about that. I doubt it. Yeah. I think he sees the difference in the two. Yeah. So, I think that's important just to understand that first and recognize that your skepticism is good. It's a natural thing. It probably helps you survive, but
Right.
also it can work against you if you haven't really studied something,
Sure.
right? Because this is something that's very different.
Right.
Now, in simple terms, this is probably one of the easiest ways to begin to understand Bitcoin when you think about it as money. So on the left side is the US money supply, and we measure that using M2, which is the form of measuring how much money we have.
Mhm.
And at the end of 2022, I think that was about $22 trillion.
Right.
This chart's a little bit old now. But Bitcoin is algorithmically capped
Right.
at 21 million Bitcoin.
Right.
So if Bitcoin is a form of money, it's obviously very different than the form that we have today, where there's no cap, there's no upper limit to it. In fact, we're printing more and more all the time,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So they're two very different things. And it turns out that Bitcoin may be the answer to the problem that's presented on the left.
Right.
All
And
right.
gold being the standard for a couple of thousand years,
Yeah.
also it's not capped, even though
Right.
it's limited.
And we'll get to that in just a second, Randy.
Oh, great. Okay. I won't get ahead of you.
Yep. Let's first, though, draw a distinction between money and currency.
Okay.
Currency is a subset of money.
Hmm.
Currency is something that's issued by governments or some kind of central authority. Okay. Money can be more than just banknotes, right? And currency, banknotes and coins. money can be things that you put your hard work into, whether it be real estate, whether it be stocks, bonds, collectibles, etc. That can be money. Those are things that are stores of value over time. It could also be gold,
Right.
right? It could be
So,
seashells. It could be cigarettes.
right. So for instance, in jail, we might trade cigarettes for other things where there is actually no money. Somebody might say that the cigarette is worth $1, but you wouldn't have to. You could say this thing over here is worth 3 cigarettes without ever having a
Yeah.
sign, a dollar value. Yeah.
Yeah, in that case, a cigarette becomes the unit of account.
Right.
Outside a jail, your government's currency is the unit of account. We're used to thinking in terms of US dollars,
Right.
not in terms of how much cigarettes it costs to buy a house,
Exactly.
right? So, one of the challenges, though, with currency is that it loses its purchasing power over time.
Mhm.
And this provocative slide here from Dante Cook says, would the dollar collapse without Bitcoin? The answer is yes. It's losing its purchasing power over time, right? Lost something like 90 some percent of its purchasing power over the last, 100 years or whatever the number is. Um,
And
so
even that is a construct
yeah,
because you could just put a multiplier on it and or divide it, whichever way you want to look at it, which some countries have done over centuries, and say, okay, $1 now is worth 10 times what it was yesterday, just because we say it is. It's the new dollar, as they call it, or
yeah.
in
And that's a
Mexico.
bit like doing a stock split. You're not really creating anything of value. You're just changing the unit of denomination.
But even this devaluation would still be a construct because it's really has to be in terms of something else.
Yeah. Yep. So what we're talking about then is if we start from the top left, people are putting their economic energy into work, and in return for that, they're getting money. Okay, but the problem is the money they receive is losing value over time. It buys less and less, whether it's, number of hamburgers or number of whatever, right? It requires more and more dollars to buy those items. That's inflation. And the flip side of that is the purchasing power of the money is less and less over time. So what people are forced to do if they want to preserve the purchasing power of their money is to invest it in places where they can hopefully preserve it.
Mhm.
And historically, that's been real estate, that's in stocks, it's precious metals like gold and other precious metals, it's bonds, fine art, other collectibles.
Right.
These are all tried and true methods of trying to preserve purchasing power of money.
And stocks would be a what do you want to call it? It would be a positionally like a business. So it might be your own business. It may
Yeah,
not be a business that has stock, but it could be a partnership, et cetera. But
that's right.
it's a
Could be
business as opposed to stocks. Yeah.
private or public companies would fit in that category, yes. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Now, we also must understand that when you think of money, there's different traits of money, right? And so this is a table to highlight some of those. And it compares gold versus the dollar versus Bitcoin.
Mhm.
So is it fungible? Is it interchangeable? Gold is. A gold bar is pretty much a gold bar. If it's pure enough, it's the same thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Same thing with the dollar, same with Bitcoin. So that's all great. They meet that standard.
Mhm.
Is it non-consumable? Like we're not talking about wheat that's consumable, right? That has a shelf life. We're talking about something that can stick around a long time. All three meet that standard.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay. Is it portable? Well, gold's kind of heavy,
Mhm.
right? It's a little hard to walk out with, several $1 million of gold in your pocket. It's going to get heavy and it's going to get expensive to transport, and also you have to pay to secure it.
And vice versa. In order to have, I guess this is not really the portability issue, but a normal amount of gold would be very small to carry around.
Yes.
Be difficult to carry and maintain, except
Yep.
maybe on a ring or something.
Sure. Yep. No, it's fine for small amounts. It's difficult for large amounts. So anyway, you can go down the list. It's durable, highly divisible. Then you get into some of the areas where gold and the dollar are inferior to something like Bitcoin.
Mhm.
So is gold easily transactable? Well, no, not really, because it's hard to go to a restaurant and shave off a part of a gold bar
Right.
or send a part of a gold bar around the world instantly. You can't do that, right? That's much easier with something that's like the dollar or Bitcoin, which is purely digital. Scarce. Gold is pretty scarce, but the problem is they do mine more,
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
right? And it's my understanding the Chinese may have discovered some massive new gold deposit. I don't know how true that is, but if it is true, then gold is not as scarce as we thought it was.
They're also finding new ways to mine it so that they're going
Oh,
back into the California gold mines and starting to find new ways to get it out inexpensively enough to make it worth it.
that's right. Right. And certainly the dollar is not scarce. They just print more all the time. Okay. Um, is it sovereign? Is it government issued? Gold? No. Although countries may control the mining of it.
Mhm.
The US dollar is government controlled and Bitcoin is not. And that's a positive in many respects. Um, is it decentralized? Bitcoin is highly decentralized. The others are not. And is it smart? Bitcoin is actually a programmable currency or a programmable form of money.
Mhm.
So anyway, this some different traits of money. Some of them are favorable, but for Bitcoin, it's highly favorable really across the board.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay. And you could add real estate to this list. You could add, art and jewelry and that kind of thing to this list and compare it across.
Sure, sure.
And what you'll see is that Bitcoin is sort of superior in pretty much all regards to other stores of value.
The one I'll take just again, I don't want to, make this into a 3 hour thing by debating little things, but on the scarcity issue, I would say that governments that issue fiat currency do tend to want to make their fiat currency scarce. They're, they generally are not looking to print
Correct.
bunches and bunches more because they recognize most governments, most leaders will recognize that fiat currency, in order to be valuable, needs to have a scarcity.
Yeah.
And most citizens would tend to believe or trust that that fiat currency will be scarce in the future.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that trust has often been misplaced.
Of course, yes, yes.
Right. There's many places where you can say, well, there's runaway inflation, whether it's Venezuela, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, you name it, Turkey, for example, in recent years. So, I think you're right. Governments don't want to print too much, but sometimes they're forced to. Yeah. So, in terms of then investing to beat inflation, there's really two metrics that are kind of important to think about. One is consumer inflation. We all know that if you keep money in a bank account, it's kind of like a melting ice cube. It'll buy less and less over time. So you want to at least invest it in something that'll earn you a return above consumer price inflation.
Right.
However, most of us also know that consumer price inflation is kind of a jerry-rigged metric,
Yeah.
right? It's probably understating what true inflation is. And maybe the upper band on that is what's called monetary inflation, is how many more dollar bills are being produced every year.
Mhm.
Right. And that's up into instead of 3% consumer inflation, that's up into the 13% monetary inflation.
Hmm.
And if you look at the returns on assets relative to that metric, there are very few investments that are actually able to meet or beat that.
Mhm.
And over the long haul, really, large cap US companies have met that standard. And only, the best performing tech companies have been able to outperform that.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, I would counter this chart just a little bit by saying that monetary inflation is also a function of wealth creation.
Yeah.
So, maybe the true bar is somewhere between monetary inflation and consumer inflation.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that would solidly put you into the real estate and equity buckets, and anything less than that wouldn't be enough.
Right. Right.
Okay. So any bonds or even gold hasn't met that standard if we're talking about, maybe 7% as a hurdle rate in order to beat
Yeah.
consumer and monetary inflation minus the wealth creation part.
And then you layer on another massive amount of complexity by the fact that it's all of these moving parts are impacting all the other moving parts.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And you measure everything relative to something else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So let's just shift gears a little bit. So if we look in recent years, um, Bitcoin has been the best performing asset class in 11, I believe, of the last 14 years.
Hmm.
And not by a little bit,
Yeah.
by a lot. It's averaged like 149% per year through December 13th,
Uh-huh.
beginning in 2011. And if we include 2010 data, it's even crazier than that. So there's something going on here. And so, what is it, right? It's clearly not, tulips.
Right.
The Dutch tulip craze lasted about a year,
Yeah.
right? This has been going pretty strong now for 14. So let's explore that a little bit and see if we can maybe gain an understanding of what is going on.
Okay.
So when we look at the world's asset value, this data may be a little bit old now in terms of there being about $900 trillion of assets in the world.
Hmm.
Let's just stick with that.
Okay.
Okay. It's a sufficiently large number. It's fine, even if it's higher today. So right now, Bitcoin has gobbled up about 2 trillion of that. It's a quarter of 1%, roughly.
Okay.
So it's just nibbled away at global assets. And we just finished talking about how Bitcoin is superior in many ways to virtually every other asset or all other assets, frankly,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? As a form of money. When you think about real estate, when you buy a property, you have to make sure it's in the right location. If you don't, you could be in trouble,
Right.
right? If you bought a building in Manhattan, your experience is very different than if you bought a building in, somewhere in Turkey or somewhere in Lebanon.
Right.
Okay. You also have the cost to maintain it.
Hmm.
You have insurance, you have taxes. You may have some legal challenges if you've got a bunch of tenants. You certainly may have damage from storms and all kinds of things. You have to put money into the property just to maintain its value.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. With stocks and bonds, you've got all kinds of risks. Companies go bankrupt all the time. There's fraud and embezzlement, right? There's confiscation from different governments sometimes in the equity markets.
Hmm.
All kinds of things can go wrong investing in stocks.
Sure.
Okay. With gold, again, we talked about that. It's expensive to store, expensive to move, it's expensive to secure, right? So you can see that Bitcoin, which has none of the problems I just listed, could be superior in many ways, and therefore people are starting to put some of their money into it. And so right now it's a quarter of 1% of the total global assets.
I mean, to be fair, you listed the negatives, but real estate could also throw off income. Bonds
Yes,
definitely throw off income. Gold, not so much, but it does have other uses. It could be turned into jewelry or into artwork or whatever.
yeah,
Artwork itself has another value because you get to appreciate it while you own it. So you do have to look at those kinds of things, which then Bitcoin or fiat currency don't share.
true. Although let's just restrain ourselves and forget about the non-monetary values because for gold and jewelry and art, there are some non-monetary value for sure.
Right.
And I suppose same thing with the beautiful building, right, or some real estate.
Right.
But if we just focus on the monetary value, you're right. There are some advantages, and if you're looking for income, right, certainly bonds and real estate and some stocks provide income.
Right.
But if you consider it from a total return perspective,
Mhm.
right, income plus or minus any capital appreciation or depreciation,
Right.
that's really the relevant metric you should look at over a longer period of time.
Right.
But you're right. There's reasons that people buy bonds and not stocks,
Right.
and reasons people buy real estate, and et cetera. Yes. My main point that I'm making here is that Bitcoin has really just begun to to gain some share of the global asset pie.
Right.
And even though that it's up, 33 million times since it started, it's still just beginning
Right.
as a $2 trillion asset class.
Sure.
Okay. Um, okay. And the other thing too, I think this gives good perspective. If it's not, sorry if it's a little hard to read, there's a lot of words on this chart, but you don't just invent something and have it become full global money overnight,
Right.
right? There's a process at which that it goes through. It has to become monetized. It has to become stable enough that it can become a medium of exchange, that it becomes a unit of account and then global money.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I don't know whether, the star where it says we are here
Hmm.
is the right positioning on this chart or not. But we're certainly down here somewhere and we're not out on the right-hand side yet.
Right.
It's going to have to gobble up far more than 2 trillion of global assets to become anywhere near anything on the right-hand side.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. So it starts out maybe as being a digital collectible, for nerds, etc. And then, you get into the speculation phase. It withstands social and technical attacks, right? Accumulates battle scars. It's proved the system is hard to change and thus reliable, right? Reduces anxiety and perceived protocol risk, right? And now we're at the point where it's being institutionalized. We'll talk about the ETFs in a minute,
Hmm.
and so on. So it's moving up this curve with the passage of time.
Right.
Okay. So I just want to kind of head off the criticisms of saying, oh, well, it's not, where can you spend Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we're not really there yet. Doesn't mean we won't be, but we're
Hmm.
just not quite there yet.
And probably it wouldn't necessarily have to be something that meets that criteria in order to also, to meet the other criteria and make it valuable.
Well, that's right. And gold, I don't know any restaurant where you can walk in with gold bars and pay for a meal, but it's still a very effective store of value.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's important. Same thing with a stock certificate. I can't walk into a restaurant with my Tesla shares and pay for a meal,
Right.
right? They should take them. If they were smart, they would take them, but I don't know of any restaurant that would. Okay. Let's just take a step back real quick and just sort of get a lay of the land in terms of the Bitcoin terminology. So everybody talks about one Bitcoin.
Hmm.
And let's just say the price of that is $100,000. Today it's in the $94,000 range, give or take. Okay. We can break Bitcoin down into smaller units. So 1/10 of a Bitcoin is called a decibit,
Hmm.
right? And then you can have 1/100th of a Bitcoin is centibit and 1/1000th is a millibit.
Hmm.
I didn't come across the terms for 1/10,000th or 1/100,000th, but 1 millionth of a Bitcoin is a microbit or
Okay.
just a bit for short.
Okay.
Okay. And then you get into smaller units than that. This is 1/10 millionth is a Finney after Hal Finney, one of the important figures in the history of Bitcoin. And then Satoshi, or a Sat, is 1/100th millionth of a Bitcoin. So in terms of the $100,000 Bitcoin price today, if that's the price roughly,
Right.
then one Satoshi is a tenth of 1 cent.
Hmm.
One Finney is a 1 cent,
Hmm.
etc. So viewed through this lens, Bitcoin is still very cheap in terms of its smallest unit, right? Think of this as like a penny equivalent,
Uh-huh.
right? 1 penny today is kind of a tenth of a penny in
Right.
Bitcoin terms.
Right.
Okay. Now, on the flip side of that, you can look at large amounts of Bitcoin. So when you look at 10 Bitcoin, that's a decabit,
Hmm.
not to be confused with decabit. It's a decabit. And then 100 is a hectobit and 1,000 is a kilobit. Kind of reminds you of the
Yes.
energy terms, right? Very similar. And that's the great thing about the metric system that most Americans don't fully appreciate. Is how easy it is to have multiples of things and understand what they mean.
Although
We won't go there.
but I still have problems with powers of 10. So,
Well, yeah,
I mean, multiplying by 12 is harder, but you can still screw up your power of 10.
you can just add another zero. It's really, really hard to mess it up. All right. If you get to 1 million Bitcoin, it's a megabit, but it's also referred to as a Nakamoto,
And Nakamoto.
right? And that would be a great place to get to. And today that would be worth about $100 million.
Got it.
Okay. Sorry, $100 billion. 100 billion.
Okay.
The algorithm maximum is 22 million coins. Actually, it might be just a slightly less than that. But today, if the price is 100,000, that's $2.1 trillion worth, right? If all of the coins were issued, which they're not quite yet,
Right.
that would be 2.1 trillion.
So what happens to the miners when they're all mined out?
They play a very important role, and that
Okay.
process would continue. I don't want to get too into
Right.
the technical weeds with this today, but the mining process is actually critical with how the ledger is updated every 10 minutes.
Okay.
So the miners, instead of earning Bitcoin from mining, they would be paid basically a transaction fee.
Got it.
Okay. All right. Let's explore for a second if Bitcoin goes from 100,000 to 1 million. Okay.
Yep.
In that case, then a Satoshi, the smallest unit, is worth a penny. Okay.
Mhm.
And the algorithm maximum of 22 million Bitcoin is now worth 21 trillion, which again, in a $900 trillion global asset pool is still not a crazy number,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? It's not that large yet. And then if we allow ourselves to think, add another zero onto this, Randy, to a $10 million per Bitcoin, now your smallest unit, Satoshi, is 10 cents, a penny is $1. And the total value of all the Bitcoin in the world, assuming none were lost, which is not correct, but if that was the case, it would be 210 trillion. Again, not a crazy stretch when you think about how superior Bitcoin is to other stores of value, that this is entirely possible at some point. Okay, not suggesting this happens anytime soon, but over
Sure.
time, absolutely could. So hopefully this gives folks a little bit more perspective. I think it's kind of helpful to stop thinking of Bitcoin as the smallest unit. In fact, it's not.
Right.
You can make it into much smaller and smaller units. So there's not really a maximum of 21 million Bitcoin. It's more like 2.1 quintillion Satoshis or something is kind of the number,
Right.
right? Okay. So this is a nice chart again from Dante Cook, sort of showing that you can think of Bitcoin as what he calls a triangle asset. You're taking the monetary premium that people subscribe to stocks and debt and art and real estate and precious metals, right? Because those have issues as a store of value, and you're putting that into Bitcoin. Organizations that have investment portfolios, whether it's university endowment funds or pension plans or companies or mutual funds or countries, are investing in Bitcoin. So it's
Mhm.
become an asset class for them.
Mhm.
And then at the bottom, you've got Bitcoin's kind of as a potential product. What can you do with it? Right? Eventually, you could have Bitcoin banking, lending, and different things that use Bitcoin as collateral. Okay. You can also use Bitcoin as a security technology, for example, for email and spam. If you and I send each other an email right now, it doesn't cost me anything.
Mhm.
But if you use Bitcoin to secure that, you could have your computer charge my computer just a little bit of Bitcoin every time there's an email sent. And that would effectively eliminate spam because now you've created an economic cost to spam. So that's what having sort of programmable or digital money could allow us to do is get rid of some of these security issues that we have on the internet today with spam and phishing attempts, things like that.
Right.
You make it economically not viable for them to pursue those strategies. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So normally when you have an asset, when the price goes up, the supply of that asset also goes up. So think about real estate. If the price of real estate skyrockets, there's a strong incentive for people to build more.
Right.
If the price of gold goes up, there's a strong incentive for people to go out and find more gold
Mhm.
or extract gold from previously mined fields in a way now that is economical.
Right.
Or send, rocket ships to the asteroids to mine gold there,
Mhm.
right? Suddenly you'd be incentivized to do it.
Right. Mhm.
But with Bitcoin, it's the opposite. There's actually a supply cap. So because there's a supply cap, then the price of Bitcoin has to go up as demand goes up.
So that would be kind of like the real estate market now. They're not
If you
building,
couldn't build any more houses, if there
they're
was a
not
rule
building.
that said you're not allowed to build more, yes, price of real estate would go up, right?
Yep.
But unfortunately, they find ways to build more real estate,
And
even oceanfront property. In the case of Dubai, they just build more islands,
that's right. There you go.
right? Or in the case of Miami, they just go skyward,
Yeah.
right? And everybody, different levels get oceanfront property.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So that's one big thing. And then when you think about what happens when you digitize something, right? Um, you've got all these examples of, the automobile, television, computer, cell phone, internet, smartphone. You dematerialize those things. It disrupts the old world,
Mhm.
and it's deflationary, right? Peter Diamandis wrote a couple of books on this. Um, and so the same thing is potentially could happen when you digitize money. Well, let's leave that thought for there. We can address that perhaps in another time. But here's sort of with Bitcoin. Um, it can become a store of value for 8 billion people, the world's population. And what it could do is dematerialize the existing stores of value. We talked about gold and
Mhm.
bonds and stocks, right? It removes the monetary premium from those assets.
Mm.
Okay. It can disrupt traditional finance by making lending, investing, and borrowing frictionless. Think about if I can move money on a Sunday anywhere in the world and I don't need a bank anymore,
Yeah.
right? Same thing with lending and investing. It just changes the way traditional finance potentially works.
So, but again, I'm not trying to be argumentative, just so that I fully understand. I mean, we do have that capability now through Venmo or PayPal or Zelle. And yes, there's some restrictions in some countries on some of those transactions, but um, uh, in general, we do have the ability to move it at any time of the day, and Zelle is completely free. So,
I can't use Zelle to send money to even Canada,
right, no,
um,
at this time.
right? And I can't move 100 million on Zelle.
Oh, okay, that's true.
So
Or or on PayPal.
right, right. So there's issues like that. And also that's larger scale, and even at the smaller scales, moving a fraction of money
Mhm.
around the world is not possible on the traditional rails that we have, right? So if my email server wants to charge yours a fraction of a cent every time you send me a message, I
Mhm.
can't really do that today,
Right, right.
right? Okay. Apologize for this one. It's really hard to see, but the concept here is that when you price things in Bitcoin, everything suddenly appears to get cheaper over time.
Hmm.
It's a deflationary asset in terms of everything else. So this is showing that, US dollar, crude oil, gold, S&P 500, the median price of a new house has gotten cheaper over time in Bitcoin. I realize no one can read these numbers. They're too faint. And then same thing with all the other currencies of the world and precious metals. So part of it is reframing our viewpoint away from this dollar-centric world to something that now is an asset that will appreciate over time, and therefore everything relative to it will appear to be depreciating over time. Right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Now, would that be though at this point, wouldn't that largely be a factor of its growing popularity as opposed to necessarily its foundational principles?
It's a factor of because it's being monetized, because people are trading one store value for this new store value that is superior.
Right. So when we get to when we have all of it mined and it became a worldwide currency, wouldn't it stabilize at that point?
Big
And
time.
and
Yes.
then you would have the things that it's measured against, like property, maybe also stabilized as opposed to.
Yes.
Yes, okay,
It
good.
should. Yeah. If it gobbles up most of the world's assets, then yes, it would be a highly stable asset. Yeah. Now, what Bitcoin really is at its core is a protocol. It's a money protocol. Actually, I would take a step further and say it's really a security protocol.
Mhm.
It turns out that it's the most secure form of sort of, software we've ever invented. And therefore, because that's true, it makes for great money, right? Why would you put money into something that's not secure? Well, you wouldn't. That would be a dumb move,
Right.
right? It'd be like having a bank vault and leaving the door open and having no guards. You're going to get looted right away. So, because Bitcoin is so secure, it's useful for many other things. But if you think about Bitcoin as a money protocol, then it's one of many. And many of these other protocols also use cryptography to keep them secure.
Mhm.
So Bitcoin is not unique in that regard.
Mhm.
All these other protocols are crypto assets in some way.
Right.
Now, there is no way to trade TCP/IP or HTTP. There is no market for HTTP. So Bitcoin is unique in that regard because these others are not investable, but Bitcoin is. Okay? But these others are critical for the way our world functions today.
Right.
Okay? I don't know that I can tell you what user datagram protocol is, but the others I'm somewhat familiar with. Right? So one of the things that makes Bitcoin really powerful is the mining network, the global distributed network of miners. And they measure the strength or the power of those miners by something called the Bitcoin hash rate. And the way to think of this is how many calculations can the Bitcoin system produce every second?
Hmm.
And it's a colossal, colossal number. So currently, as of December 26th, the hash rate was 743 exahash per second. Okay. What's an exahash? All right. One hash is one calculation per second. Kilohash, megahash, gigahash, terahash, petahash, exahash. It's 1 quintillion hash calculations per second. Here's the number here. It's a big number. It's a lot of zeros.
Yeah.
Okay. As more and more computing power is added to the Bitcoin network, it becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. Think about it in military terms. The more tanks and the more battleships and the more airplanes you have, the stronger you are and the harder it is to break.
Hmm. Hmm.
If I could control more than 51% of the world's Bitcoin mining computers, then effectively, in some ways, I could control Bitcoin as a system. So if I'm, a country, let's say like Russia or perhaps China, that says, oh, I can corrupt this and take this for myself, at this point, it would be very difficult because I'm up against, 743 quintillion calculations per second. I have to invest billions and billions of dollars to get that much computing power to even have a chance.
Hmm. Hmm.
Not to mention all the energy and infrastructure to run these computers.
Right.
So you can see on this previous chart that the Bitcoin network is only beginning stronger. And yeah, there's some peaks and valleys in some of this. I think back here, China banned Bitcoin mining for a period of time. And so all those miners had to leave China and set up shop somewhere else. And so there was a dip that happened here. But now the network has never been stronger. Okay. So think about it again in military terms. The amount of exahash in the system is, the number of the strength of the military, so to speak. And the interesting thing about this is if Russia, for example, decides to invest heavily in Bitcoin mining, they only make the system stronger overall,
Hmm.
right? It's like having the world's militaries all combine at the same time. It's making the world a safer place in that regard. Now, you could argue that whether that's the case in the physical world, but certainly with Bitcoin in the digital world, a larger and larger system makes the system more and more secure.
Hmm.
Okay. All right. So this I think is complex. It's an important thing to understand. No one controls the Bitcoin network. No country, no government controls it.
Mhm.
It's a globally distributed system of computers. Now, what's actually happening here? Why do we need such a strong and powerful computer system? So again, without getting too technical, here's a way to think about that. Bitcoin is a global ledger, and every 10 minutes, these computers are fighting for the right to make an entry on the ledger. And it's decentralized because no one controls who gets that right. The computers have to do battle every 10 minutes to see who wins. They do battle by guessing a phenomenally long number.
Right.
And that's why you need massive computing power, because all these computers are doing is guessing a massive, massive number. Right? Now, this Bitcoin system is beautiful in the sense that it controls this. If more computers were suddenly added and the time to make the guess goes from 10 minutes down to 9 minutes,
Mhm.
they would make the difficulty of guessing that number even harder so that it's back to 10 minutes again. So they want this like clockwork every 10 minutes to be a global battle to see who writes the next entry on the Bitcoin ledger. It's like going to your bank and every 10 minutes the bank manager having the ability to change the ledger.
Right.
In this case, it's a different person every time. And then there's a system around the world to verify all that to make sure nothing was done in an improper way.
Mhm.
And that's where it gets highly technical, and I'll leave that to other people to describe. Okay. All right. So what we're seeing here then is this combination of transferring value, energy, and information into this investable asset. We've never seen anything like this before. There's nothing like this has ever existed.
Yeah, yeah. That I was already certain of.
Yeah. People often ask me, how do you value this? There's no cash flows. Well, it's not a company.
Yeah.
It's this thing that represents monetary value. It's this thing that's taken energy, real world energy, to make it secure, right? And it's going to allow us to have this form of digital money that no one controls. And so in the age of AI, where we have autonomous agents buying and selling things for us, we're going to need something like this, right? Particularly if there's going to be micropayments for different things.
Right.
Our current system can't handle it. Visa and MasterCard and all that, they won't be able to process the number of transactions that this will require. Now, nor will Bitcoin itself be able to. There'll be layers on top of it to be able to process the massive amount of transactions that'll happen.
Mhm.
Yeah. The Bitcoin network's a slow lumbering beast by design. Every 10 minutes, the ledger gets updated. That'll never change.
Mhm.
Okay. So again, back to kind of from an investment standpoint, this is an example here. If you had 90% cash and 10% Bitcoin, what your return would be. So if you're approaching it maybe from a company and you've got all this cash on your balance sheet,
Mhm.
over this period of time since April 30, 2020, this 90-10 portfolio would have returned 17, almost 18% per year. And you had 90% cash and just 10% in Bitcoin.
Right.
So even if you're a company and you don't want to take all your cash and put it all into Bitcoin, even a fraction of it
Mhm.
can make a huge difference. Okay. All right. One of the big criticisms that Bitcoin has is it doesn't have enough history. But that really doesn't hold water either, because if you consider that leading up to the creation of Bitcoin is a whole history of work and technology that was developed. So we start with cryptography back in the 70s, right? And then other things, linked timestamping, public keys as identifiers, the Byzantine fault tolerance, digital cash, proof of work, smart contracts, peer-to-peer network, etc. All these things had to be created in order for Bitcoin as it stands today to exist. So this is actually a technology that's been many decades in the making. And while it's only been around since 2009, right? And there's only really data on it since July of 2010. It's really a lot older than just 14 years.
Gotcha.
And I think this is lost on a lot of people. And I apologize again for the fuzziness of this. Hopefully you can read enough of it, but there were a lot of people involved in developing some of the precursors to what we see as Bitcoin today. Okay. Also, from this point of view, the iPhone came out in 2007, Uber 2009, right? So Bitcoin's as old as Uber. Do you trust Uber? Do you trust Venmo? Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah.
You know, um, I don't know how persuasive this chart is, but just put it in context. Some of the companies that we're comfortable with today,
Sure.
Instagram 2010,
Yeah.
it's been around longer than that.
Tesla, SpaceX.
Yeah. Right. Tesla IPO'd around the same time that there's good data on Bitcoin pricing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a fun one to compare the two. Yeah. All right. Also, Bitcoin runs 24/7. There's no holidays in Bitcoin. There's no market hours. It's a 24/7 market. So there's actually, since 2010, more hours than what the stock market has represented since 1971.
Sure.
So, from that standpoint, there's actually quite a lot of history to it. Okay. All right. Isn't Bitcoin like gambling, Randy?
Well, on any given day, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Now, in gambling, these are the rough odds of winning at various casino games. None of them are more than 50%.
Right.
Right. Slots are among the lowest. You can get close to 50 in some of these other games. Right. Vegas wasn't built on your winnings. Vegas was built on your losses. But Bitcoin here, this is from Dante Cook again, 96%. So very different than gambling. Also, the same thing is often thrown at stocks. Isn't investing in stocks like gambling? Well, no, because your expected return is positive, not negative. Now, with Bitcoin, depending on the time frame, as you mentioned, over 1 year, 70% of the 1 year periods have been positive. Over 5 years, it's closer to 98.5%. Again, short history, but still an equivalent history to the stock market history since 1971. Decent amount of time. All right. Another sort of FUD busting thing is, Bitcoin's a bad store of value. And it's like, okay, how much did an iPhone cost in terms of Bitcoin? Well, the iPhone 4, when it came out, would have cost 2,857 Bitcoin. Fast forward to iPhone 13, it would have cost 0.02 Bitcoin. So if you start thinking about the world in that terms, right, iPhone's got a lot cheaper. Whereas in dollar terms, they probably held about the same. So, all right. From Toma Strollite here, he says, you can't print more food, you can't print more houses, you can't print more energy, and you can't print more Bitcoin. Each requires work to create, right? You've got to do the work to get food, do the work to build a house, do the work to get more energy. Same thing with Bitcoin. Work has to be performed. These mining machines have to engage in this global battle every 10 minutes that consumes a ton of energy. That's what makes Bitcoin so secure. So each is what's called proof of work. They're proving their work every 10 minutes in the case of Bitcoin. But you can print more photos, digital tokens, metaverse assets. They require no work. So here he's sort of saying that the other crypto assets are not like Bitcoin. You can just create more of them, and people have. Right? They're called altcoins. Is also another term for these altcoins that I won't mention on air here. But don't confuse other crypto assets with Bitcoin. They're very different. Now, some of them could be very useful, but not as a store of value, not in the same way that we're talking about Bitcoin here. Okay. All right. From a company's perspective, if you've got capital to put to work, right? You're always faced with the decision, can I earn a return on this capital, or should I be returning it to my shareholders so that they can do something with it? Right? And a lot of companies accumulate cash. Some of them use that cash for their operations. Some of them use that cash for acquisitions. Some of them just accumulate cash over time.
Sure.
And the problem with cash accumulating on a company's balance sheet is it becomes a drag on the returns on the capital of the company. So here's a provocative chart again by Dante Cook saying, what if you could buy an asset that grows 60% a year? In case of Bitcoin, it's been more than that.
Huh?
You don't have to train, integrate, or do R&D for it, right? You don't have to hold it like property on the balance sheet, right? You don't need an acquisition to get it, but it positions your business for the future, reduces your need to borrow capital, and it's becoming more scarce. And he says it's like buying Amazon in the year 2000. I don't know. It's one way to think about it. I'm not sure that I would necessarily think about it in these terms, but provocative anyway.
No.
Okay. Let's shift gears and talk about ETFs. So earlier this year, Bitcoin ETFs were approved. I think there were 10 of them that were approved at once.
Mhm.
And they started taking assets. And so as it stands now, if this data is correct, and I don't have the date on here, but I think it's fairly recent, that they now hold over 1.3 million Bitcoin, which is about 5% of the total Bitcoin supply, and it's worth about $140 billion.
Right.
This is the fastest uptake
Mm.
of any ETF in history. And it shows the demand that's there for Bitcoin from people that can't buy it directly or don't want to buy it directly. Buying Bitcoin directly yourself requires you to be very careful.
Yeah, yeah. As my brother said yesterday, he bought some, you know, I don't know, 10 years ago and never paid him any more attention to it. He hopes he knows where his password is.
Yeah. Yeah, I know somebody that bought Bitcoin back in the early days, forgot about it, was able to recover it, and sold it for $1 billion.
$1 billion.
Yeah. Now, they probably shouldn't have sold it because now it would be worth about $2 billion.
$2 billion.
But, you know, yeah,
Yeah, billion here, billion there.
yeah. So the Bitcoin ETF now from BlackRock has now passed the gold ETF, GLD, as having more assets,
Mm.
right? At this time, this was December 19th. I think it had 78%. I think I saw an update to this that it had passed, but if it hasn't, it's awfully close.
Yeah.
Okay. And it may, it would have done that in just 1 year. So this ETF took 227 days to get to 50 billion in assets.
Mm.
Fastest ETF uptake in history.
Mm.
Okay. The other thing too is just this morning, this was announced from Bitwise. They're starting an ETF that's based on what they're calling the Bitcoin Standard Corporation. So they're investing in companies that are adopting Bitcoin as their treasury standard. And these companies would have to hold at least 1,000 Bitcoin in the corporate treasury to qualify for the fund.
Mm.
And so there are now 60 public companies that we know of that hold Bitcoin.
Mhm.
And you can see that 22 of them have 1,000 or more, including Tesla.
Right.
I've seen numbers where Tesla has about 11,000 Bitcoin. I'm not quite sure what's accurate, whether it's the 9,720 or if it's more than this.
Right.
Either way, Tesla's in the top 4 or 5 corporate holders of Bitcoin in the world. But the largest one is MicroStrategy by far, with now 444,000 Bitcoin
Right.
on its balance sheet. Now, MicroStrategy isn't the only one buying it. These public companies bought more recently. Many of them are Bitcoin miners, not all of them.
Mm.
Here's an announcement from Semler Scientific. They acquired 211 Bitcoin on December 16th. This term Bitcoin yield means how much were they able to increase their Bitcoin per share over time. So for this year to date for them, it's been 67%.
Hmm.
So as a shareholder in this company, by doing nothing, your ownership in Bitcoin has increased by 67%
Mm.
because of the actions this company has taken. Okay. We're seeing Hut 8 buy some Bitcoin. Here's Riot Platforms, which is another Bitcoin miner, acquiring more. Here is another Bitcoin miner. They now have 44,000, so it's about 10% of what MicroStrategy owns. And here's MicroStrategy itself. Their last announcement on the 23rd bought another $500 million worth. And their Bitcoin yield this year is now almost 74%. So if you were a shareholder on January 1, your Bitcoin per share has increased by 74% this year so far.
Mm.
So you can't really think of that as a dividend yield, but it's similar in some ways in terms of what was the gain and number of Bitcoin that you owned.
Right.
Okay. And MicroStrategy, by the way, is selling stock to buy Bitcoin.
Right.
But they're doing it in a way that's actually accreting value to their shareholders, not diluting them. And that's kind of a remarkable thing. And here's the chart of MicroStrategy's Bitcoin over time.
Mm.
And you can see here recently it's gone pretty much vertical. They announced at the end of their third quarter that they were going to invest up to 42 billion over the next 3 years. Well, they did, I think, a third of that, or maybe almost half of that here in the last 5 or 6 weeks.
Right.
And the reason that they're able to do it so quickly is because there's massive demand for it. The market is begging them for more bonds and stock. Yeah. So Barron's then reported that MicroStrategy wants the ability to issue enough shares to buy all the world's Bitcoin. And I thought it was funny because Saylor then quipped that I get all my best ideas from Barron's. The reason that this came up is because MicroStrategy filed to increase their share count from 300 some million to 10.3 billion shares.
Hey.
Right. And this was, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal or something that's talking about MicroStrategy's fans hold a feverish allegiance to the company that transcends the attention everyday investors pay to humdrum investments in their portfolios. So to a Tesla investor, this might remind you of the criticism that people throw at you about Elon and his fans.
Yes, yes.
A very similar kind of dynamic happening now with MicroStrategy. Okay. And then here's Barron's, famously, back in May of 1999, I believe,
Mm.
talking about how bad Amazon was and, Amazon.bomb. So Barron's may not be the best source of intelligent discussion about some of these things.
For sure.
Okay. All right. Bitcoin returns this year, it's up about 125% if the price is around 95,000.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a 31.6 million X gain since July of 2010.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a couple of or three big down periods,
Mm-hmm.
but any store of value asset can have big declines. Real estate does, stocks do, gold certainly has.
Sure.
So you don't have to require assets go up, all the time to be good stores of value. And in fact, I'd happily take this kind of return stream to get this kind of result.
Yeah, knowing what
Right.
we know now.
Knowing what we know now. Yeah. Past performance is no guarantee of future results for sure. Yeah. And so like Elon, Michael Saylor has kind of become a meme-worthy person.
Uh-huh.
And he typically posts memes about himself all the time, which is also quite funny. So MicroStrategy is one of the most volatile stocks in the stock market, but they actually use that volatility to their advantage by selling convertible bonds. A convertible bond is simply a bond plus a call option. And call options only have value if there is fluctuation in the underlying stock. And because MicroStrategy has massive fluctuation in the underlying stock, they were able to sell these convertible bonds, get a lot of money up front, and turn around and buy Bitcoin with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that should be permanent capital on MicroStrategy's balance sheet. And then they're also selling stock periodically because the stock trades at a premium to MicroStrategy's Bitcoin holdings. And they're able to turn around and take that money, that premium, and immediately buy Bitcoin, and that accretes value for the existing shareholders. So whether the stock goes up or down doesn't matter. They're harvesting that volatility to the shareholders' benefit.
Right.
Okay. All right. One final thing, shifting gears completely.
Okay.
Okay. Still relating to Bitcoin, but complete shift of gears here.
Yeah, yeah.
When Russia invaded Ukraine,
Uh-huh.
one of the things that the Western world decided to do was kick Russia out of the SWIFT banking network.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Trillions of dollars are moved on this network every day between banks.
Right.
They used the monetary system, global monetary system, as a weapon against Russia.
Hmm.
Now, I'm not suggesting that was a bad idea, right? It may have been a very logical response to try to punish Russia for what they did, but it had its consequences because now Russia is using Bitcoin in foreign trade. They've made an
Hmm.
end run around SWIFT,
Hmm.
right? And this is on Christmas Day, they announced this. This is just a couple days ago.
Hmm.
So there's consequences to these actions that we take. And in
Sure.
this case, it's forced Russia to use Bitcoin because it's a decentralized global network.
Right.
And now it may also force other countries to begin using Bitcoin in foreign trade. So you can see that the ball keeps rolling and
Hmm.
moving forward,
Hmm.
right? All right. And then holding with the theme that Bitcoin is, a secure system. Jason Lowery, who wrote a book, and I'll show the cover here in a second, he says, imagine inventing a weapon that physically prevents attackers from denying people access to their private property without resulting in bloodshed, creating the most game-changing human defense in 200,000 years. Defense tech in 200,000 years. And then refusing to call it a weapon because the weapon sounds bad. That's what he says Bitcoin is. Bitcoin has the word coin in its name.
Hmm.
At its core, it is not money. At its core, it is a technology that happens, in Jason's view, to be a form of a weapon system.
Right.
Okay. He draws the example of when the Chinese invented a black powder. It had these explosive properties to it, but because it was invented by people in the medical field, it sat in a glass jar on a shelf and they never really knew what to do with it. And it wasn't until Chinese engineers discovered that it had explosive powers and they could make bombs and fireworks with it. Right? They didn't know they invented gunpowder. They thought it was medicine.
Right.
And he's saying the same thing has kind of happened here with Bitcoin, is we don't realize that what has been invented is truly a weapon system. It's a defense system for cyberspace, right? In the real world, for attacks on land, sea, space, and air, we have a way to counteract that with physical force.
Sure.
Well, in cyberspace, Bitcoin can be used in the same way. Because in order to use Bitcoin to attack, you have to use a ton of energy to attack the Bitcoin network. It becomes very, very cost prohibitive.
Hmm.
So these systems actually are very similar. Now, I'm not doing a very good job of describing here because it's a very complex topic. And if people are interested, I would suggest reading this book, which is Jason's thesis from MIT. He published this in February 2023, but he'd been working on it for, months and years beforehand and posting a lot of his discussion on X and doing all kinds of YouTube videos. If you go to YouTube, look up Jason Lowery, you'll see a ton of stuff from him. If you don't want to read this book is 400 pages. It's one of the best books I've ever read.
Hmm.
And the part about Bitcoin is at the end.
Okay.
Leading up to it is a fascinating walk through the sort of the history of warfare and how every single organism uses warfare to get what it wants.
Hmm.
Okay. And that's not even doing this book justice. It's a really great read. And shortly after this was published, Jason wrote this on X. For those asking what's been going on with me, I was ordered to take software down and asked to stop talking about the subject publicly. It doesn't appear on MIT's library either. Can't talk details, but things are good and I'm working hard behind the scenes. Appreciate the kind words. So again, our government, I think, started to realize that what Jason was talking about is true.
Hmm.
That as a digital warfighting technology, Bitcoin could be very useful. And if that's the case, we want to make sure we control it
Really? Yeah,
and
yeah,
not have it in anybody else's hands.
yeah, yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean that the United States has to own all the Bitcoin in the world, but we need to own enough, and our allies own enough of the mining operations to make sure the Bitcoin network is in good hands.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. With that, I'll leave you with this. This is Michael Saylor's presentation. If you want to learn more about Bitcoin, this is a great place to start. It's called the Digital Gold Rush. It's about an hour-long presentation. If you go to Michael's website, just Google Michael Saylor website,
Mhm.
you'll see that there as well as a bunch of other great presentations. So with
Cool.
that, Randy, we'll leave it there.
Okay.
Do you have any questions, or do you completely understand Bitcoin at this point?
I don't think that I missed, I asked the questions along the way. I don't think I completely understand Bitcoin, but I do think that I understood everything you said.
That's
But the,
amazing because I'm not sure I understood everything
oh,
I
I
said.
see. Oh, no. Well, I may
Yeah.
not have understood the underlying principles which which you drew your conclusions from, but because there's maybe a lot more to some of those things than met the eye. But I'd love to know in the comments below whether people had questions for CERN. I'm sure that CERN wouldn't mind even, checking out the YouTube video from time to time and the X post from time to time to see what questions people brought up, because I think that was a very thorough, useful way to take a first walk through Bitcoin. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I'd be happy to, although I would just add this caveat that it would be too difficult for me to answer every question. And many of the questions have been answered before by many people. So it's just a matter of doing, a little searching on YouTube,
sure.
X, the internet in general,
Right.
if you have questions, because a lot of this information is out there.
Yeah,
And I certainly don't view it as my job to convince anybody of anything in regards to this.
you're,
Right. So I'm not
you're
going
not
to
a
take it personally if you
proselytizer.
disagree with me.
You're not a proselytizer. You're just a professor.
Something like that.
Professor, you profess.
Profess.
You
Yes.
profess that you have this knowledge that you're passing along that might be useful in somebody's investment uh, thinking going forward.
Yeah. My main message, I think, from today is that something very important is going on here.
Right.
And it just might be, possibly be, one of the largest changes that you and I have ever seen
Right.
in our global monetary system.
Mhm.
Maybe.
Maybe,
It
maybe.
remains to be seen. We
Right.
can't dismiss it at this point. There's enough going on here that something big is happening. And the question is, how big will it be? We don't know yet.
Right.
The big event that folks are excited about next year, it was ETFs this year. Next year is the prospect of the United States establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Right.
Okay. Now, Jason argues that that should be controlled by the Department of Defense, not U.S. Treasury.
Mm.
So we'll see how it's structured and how that transpires.
Yeah.
Is it just money or is it a
Right.
cyberspace weapon system?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, CERN, as always, we thank you for coming on and providing not only a very thorough conversation around something, but something that is, illuminated or gains more clarity by your charts, your graphs, your other visuals. That unfortunately, Randy is like. Do you know that that when I was young and skinny, really skinny, I would never get chosen first on any team until they got to know me because I was wiry. They
You
didn't
should be
know
good in
that.
dodgeball because they wouldn't be able to hit you with the
They
ball.
wouldn't be
You
able
just
to
turn
hit me.
sideways.
But I was also wiry, so I was actually pretty good
Yeah.
as an athlete. But they didn't know that when they first picked me. Well, nothing has changed though with Pictionary. I'm still always the last one chosen for Pictionary. Yes. It doesn't matter how well they know me. I'm still absolute last for the Pictionary team. Yeah.
Well, we need to invent some kind of AI that can assist you in Pictionary, a chat GPT for Pictionary.
There must be. There must be.
Yeah, if you could only use Grok.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, come on. I need some assistance. All right, CERN, thank you again for coming on. And to all of you out there, it's been great. Well, CERN, you should say the ending.
Thanks, Randy.
It's been great.
That's my line is
You
thanks,
did,
Randy.
you did all the talking though, so you should say the ending.
It's your ending. It's your show.
It's been great talking to you.
It has been. Thank you, Randy.